Greetings, dear viewers. This is George from Ireland. Today I'm going to ask a pertinent question. Is America a shithole country? It's very topical because a few days ago Trump said that the whole of Africa and several Latin American countries were shitholes, and he didn't want these people moving to the United States. So got to ask, is the USA a shithole country? Well, look at the level of violent crime. The murder rate is much higher than in comparable Western high-income countries, possibly to do with the easy availability of guns. The United States has got the highest per capita prison population in the world. Many of those people are in for possession of drugs. About a third of them are in. So the private prison industry wants to keep as many people incarcerated as possible. That's not what the land of the free should be doing, addicted to taking away people's freedom, and then taxpayers have to pay through the nose to keep people in prison who shouldn't be there. There is very little health care for those on low incomes. Congress just took away free health care from poor children so they could give yet another tax cut to billionaires. It's the height of immorality. The United States is not the land of opportunity it once was. Higher education is now exorbitantly expensive, and for working class people or middle class people, they have to go hugely into debt to get a bachelor's degree to then do an unpaid internship. So those without wealthy families find it an awful lot more difficult to break into the professional classes. And it wasn't always like that. Whereas the USA could very easily fix this problem. Look at racism. A large minority of Americans acknowledge harboring racist attitudes when they answer surveys. You see how President Obama was monstered for his race. And there's a lot of religious prejudice, bigotry against Muslim Americans. Look at Guantanamo Bay, a standing affront to America's sacred constitutional principles. Some of these men there have been incarcerated for 16 years without trial. It's a screaming outrage. America wouldn't tolerate it if Iran had taken Americans from abroad and imprisoned them in Iran for 16 years without trial on suspicion of terrorism. So why is it okay for America to do likewise? Hyper-nationalism. Some people will have simply exploded with rage that I should even ask the question in this video. So it's difficult not to feel conceited if you're a superpower. When the United Kingdom was at the zenith of the British Empire, many British people were arrogant. When the Germans were mighty, some of them were very stuck up. China is getting stronger, and so some Chinese people have an unduly high opinion of their country. So people seem to assume that military superiority means moral superiority, and that everything about one's country is better than others, which isn't necessarily the case. Militarism is another problem. This excessive exaltation of the military and the belief that almost half the budget should be spent on the military, and the US spends more on its military than many other countries combined, and quite a few of those are allies, is grossly in excess of the needs of national defense. The USA has military bases in over 100 other countries around the world. How would Americans feel if China had military bases in 100 other countries and China had bases on America's borders? People would feel menaced by that. So aggression, sometimes thinking that a military response is the only solution to any problem, being the arsenal of Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine, and funding the Israeli military, despite knowing that the Israeli military has deliberately killed thousands of Palestinian civilians. The military-industrial complex has way too much clout in American politics. Who invented this phrase, military-industrial complex? It wasn't a left-wing conspiracy theorist. It was President Eisenhower, a Republican, a former five-star general. He said that whether they seek it or not, this clique has way too much say in Washington, D.C. So military manufacturing companies and certain politicians have a unhealthily cozy relationship with big campaign donations, and that's why the American taxpayer has to pay for a hugely bloated military. And these are the only permanent jobs with free education, free healthcare that there seem to be. Despite Eisenhower being a right-winger and a military man, the John Birch Society said he was a communist. It was an absolutely ludicrous accusation, but one sees the same things going on today or recently malevolent wingnuts saying that Obama was a Muslim. Wouldn't be bad if he was. Saying that he was a socialist, despite this being bogus. Look how he fought the Taliban and ISIS. Look how he had bin Laden killed. So there are many malicious loonies in the United States, more so than its fair share, not just Christian dominionists and gun nuts. They're climate change deniers, and the United States pollutes per capita more so than any other country in the world. 3% of the population of the world producing about 20% of the carbon emissions. And big oil, obviously, is funding these climate change deniers. The USA is the only country in the world to pull out of the Paris deal, out of 192 countries. The scientific community hasn't been wrong on something so big for a very long time indeed. For every time the scientific community gets something wrong, they have been right hundreds of times. And even if they are wrong on climate change, green energy is still a way forward. There'd still be less pollution. We still wouldn't have oil slicks so often or gas tank explosions and so forth. Now, every country has its wackos, but the USA seems to have an awful lot. Now, let's look at the positive side. The United States is by no means the worst. There are many governments which are tyrannical around the world, and the United States is not like that. The Constitution limits the damage that a demagogue like Trump can do. The United States at least has free expression. People are allowed to excoriate and ridicule the president, and that's a very healthy thing, even in the case of a president whom I admire, such as Obama. Most states in the USA do not have the death penalty. Those that retain it only impose it for murder, and even then rarely. Only about 1% of those convicted of murder are actually executed in the United States. People are allowed to move from one state to another, or as they say, America, love it or leave it. Americans can leave their country if they wish to. Not all countries permit that. And the United States is often on the right side of disputes. I supported the liberation of Afghanistan and Iraq. Sometimes the way it was done was brutal, even for an armed conflict, sometimes deliberately killing civilians. But still, the United States was on the right side. The USA has the ability to heal itself through its democratic processes. Campaign finance reform would be a good way to start. Having publicly funded healthcare for all would also be excellent. Extending Medicare and Medicaid to all citizens. Private health insurance could still exist for those who wish to pay for it. That's the way it is in my part of the world. So a lot could be done to improve life. So it's difficult to blame Americans for sometimes having an unduly high opinion of their country because their media is often an echo chamber, especially on the right, telling them how splendid their country is. The thing is, people must be willing to learn. I don't assume that the way things are in my country is necessarily right, and we're not the best at everything or even at most things. We could be wrong, and I often examine my own opinions. Is privately funded healthcare a better option, for example? So people should try and lay aside national prejudices and not be chauvinistic. Trump wondered why so few Norwegians wished to move to the United States. Well, what is it that's so much better about life in Norway than in the United States? A century ago, it was the other way around, and large numbers of Norwegians did immigrate to the United States. So you must ask yourself, what has changed? I don't believe the United States is a shithole country. I think it was a revoltingly racist and insulting thing of Trump to say about all these countries. He denies he says it, but are we to believe the most dishonest man in America who's told hundreds of provable lies on the record, or are we to believe several other witnesses? He didn't say what he did actually say. He just said the language was tough, but tough is his code word for barbaric. So no, America is not a shithole country, nor is it fascistic. There are tendencies among some sections of American society in that direction, but it's certainly not all bad.